Hey, sixth grade. So today we are going to experiment with a couple of different watercolor techniques so that you guys can pick your favorite when we begin to paint our Wonder abstracted self-portraits. So what you are going to need today is one of these red boxes filled with supplies. You're also going to need a Sharpie and a large watercolor sheet of paper. First thing you are going to do is you are going to fold your paper into 8 equal sections. So you're first going to fold it in half once, using the palm or your fingers to straighten out that line. Then you're going to fold it in half again. So if I were to open this all the way back up, I would have 6 equal sections at this point. And then for my last fold, I'm going to fold it in half one more time. I'm using my Sharpie to make that a nice crease. When I open it all back up, I can see that I have 8 folds in my paper. Now what we need to do is label the different folds because we are going to have 8 different watercolor techniques that we're going to go over today. So grab your Sharpie. In the first section, you're going to follow along with me. We're going to label wash. And you'll learn a lot more about what these terms mean as we go along. The second section on this bottom line, you can just put dry brush. The third section, rubbing alcohol. The last section on this front row is salt. Moving down to the bottom line, we have wet, and with a hyphen, wet. Wet and wet. Next we have wax resist, W-A-X, resist. We have gradient following wax resist. And last but not least, we have plastic wrap. So we are going to get started. I wanted to show you what is in your bucket before we just dive in. Please be very careful with the buckets. First of all, we have your watercolor palettes. Some of them are a little messier than others. Just try your best to ignore sort of the mess that you might see on the white. But for the most part, the colors are all still good. Then you also have a water cup with your brushes in it. We want to make sure the water cup stays in the red bucket just in case it spills. We'll contain the spill a little bit. Then you also have 2 little cups. One of the cups is filled with salt, regular table salt, and the next cup is filled with rubbing alcohol. So very important that we don't mistake this as water from our water cup. This is something different than our water. Next we have quite a few different Q-tips, and we have plastic wrap. Just little pieces of it, and I'll explain what we're going to do with that in just a moment. So to start out, what you're going to do is you're going to find your paint palette. Please don't argue about which paint palette you get. Just grab one. They're all made the same. And you're going to grab your paintbrush. The first thing you are going to do, and you'll do this flat on your table. I'm going to hold it up to the camera. You're going to grab some water and just lightly put a little bit of water in each of the colors on your paint palette. Notice I'm barely tapping my paint palette. This is so that water can get saturated in the colors because these are watercolors, so they do need water, of course, in order to work. Great. So now that that's getting nice and saturated, I'm going to start off with some few easy watercolor techniques. The first one we're going to talk about is wash. So up here in this left-hand corner. Since this is an experiment, I don't really care how this looks at the end. We're just having fun and playing around. With my brush, I'm going to grab just any random color. I'm going to choose red for my wash. Going to get a nice bit of color on there. And a wash is essentially just a solid layer of whatever color you chose. So I can start at the top so I can practice. And it's really just a big old block of color. That's a wash. If I want to experiment, I can maybe wring out some of the water. Oops, I just told you not to do that. I can wring out some of the water with my fingers in my water cup and try it again to see if I get a darker color this time. Ooh, yes. So the more water you use in watercolors, the more transparent the color will be and the less color actually will get onto your paper. So you can definitely see that this second one is quite a bit darker than my first round. Take some time to experiment on your own. I might even try a different color this time. But a wash is just a solid layering of color. Ooh, that one's very light. So you'll start to notice which colors you really enjoy working with and which colors you're like, I might stay away from that on my final portrait. All right, now I'm gonna rinse my brush out. And next I'm gonna move on to dry brush. Now, we're gonna do the first part of dry brush now, and then we're gonna come back to it a little later because well, you'll see, our brushes have to be dry. But all you're gonna do for this first layer of dry brush is you're going to paint a wash. Okay, so you can pick whatever color you want. I'm going to pick a darker purple. And I'm just gonna lay down a nice wash. But just like I just said, we will be coming back. So don't worry, we are not leaving it like this. Just for fun, I'm going to do one more little wash on this side, just so I have some fun colors to play with when I come back to it. Rinsing my brush out every time that I switch colors so I don't miss my paint palette. Next, what we're going to do is we are going to go down to this bottom left-hand corner, what is called wet and wet. For this one, I need you to not pick up any color on your brush. You're actually going to take some water and just lightly cover a section of your paper. I know it's really hard for you guys to see this. Hopefully maybe you can see like a little bit of shine. So wet and wet means that I'm painting with my wet watercolors on wet paper. And you're gonna see a really cool effect from doing this. Choose whatever color you would like. I'm gonna work with this fuchsia. And then I'm just gonna paint a little area. Ooh, you can see how it really spreads out. And if I want to switch up my colors and mix, I'm going to do a little bit of red. You can see the colors are really runny. So even if I picked up my paper, whoop, you would see that there's a lot of water. So it will slide down your paper if you're not very careful. So that's why we want to make sure that we're not doing what Miss Morrow just did, and leave it flat on your table. All right, so the colors get nice and mixed in. It's a really nice effect. Next, I am going to move on to rubbing alcohol, this upper corner. This one, you will need your rubbing alcohol little bin. You will also need a Q-tip. So just like we did with the wash, I'm gonna just first of all put a layer of color down. creating a nice wash. Then I'm going to take my Q-tip, dip it into my alcohol, and carefully dot it on my paper. You can see what it happens once you dip it. Because the alcohol repels water, it's leaving these white spots. Another pretty cool effect that has almost a little crystallized effect to it as it dries more. Let me bring it closer to the camera. So that's definitely a fun one. You can also do this while you mix colors. So if I wanted to start with green, rinse out my brush, and then grab some darker green and mix. You can still see that it has the same effect. Now, if I do it too much and too close, it's just going to turn my entire watercolor white, which, what would be the point of that? Okay, so that's rubbing alcohol. It basically makes those little white spheres. And once you're done with these Q-tips, you can definitely just throw them away at the end of class. We don't want to hold on to them since they're used. Next, we are going to move on to salt. And this one is one of my favorites because I'll put my rubbing alcohol back. We're using plain old table salt to get a really cool texture when we watercolor. So you're going to pick out your brush. You're going to pick a color. And again, we're going to just do a simple wash on our paper. And we're going to sprinkle some salt. And you can't see it right now, but what it's doing is it's kind of forming little crystals on your watercolor paper. And in a day when this dries, we can brush off the salt and see what is revealed underneath. I'm going to try it one more time with a bit more water. Take a little pinch. Put it on my paper, and you can see it really does form a pretty interesting texture on your paper. Moving right along, we are going to go down to plastic wrap. At the bottom corner of your paper, I am going to grab my brush, and once again, you're going to do a nice wash on your plastic wrap section. Plastic wrap works kind of like salt, where we're going to do a nice wash. And then we use this plastic wrap here. We can kind of crumble it up. And all you're going to do is just place it on your paper and leave it. Okay? Once this dries, it's going to have a really cool effect and texture, but we want to make sure it dries a little bit before we come back to it. So we're just going to leave that there and move on to gradient. Now, gradient is a little bit more process with it. Gradient is when you want to go from one color to another color, but show the nice transition. So what this means is if I want to go from red to green, what I would do is I would go and kind of think about the color wheel, and I would go from red to orange, from orange to yellow, from yellow to green, in order to get the gradient instead of just transferring it from red to green, which would give me a really gross muddy color. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So if I start with red, I'm just going to paint a little line, wash out my brush, then I'm going to switch to orange. Now when I put orange on my paper, I don't want to put it right under the red because it's just going to bleed together. What I want to do is I want to start a little bit further down and work my way up so that we combine and we kind of make a nice red-orange in the middle here. I know it's a little difficult to see right now, but I'll bring it up to the screen in a second. Again, I wash my brush out, And I'm going to find yellow, because that's next on the color wheel. Again, working my way from a little bit below to where my orange is, so that those colors mix. Ooh, that looks really pretty. Kind of looks like a sunset right now. And my last color, in order for me to get all the way from red to green, would be to use the green. I have a lighter green on my watercolor palette, so I'm going to use that before I go to the darker green. Again, washing my brush out between every single color change. So that is my nice, beautiful gradient. This is one of my favorites. And what's really cool about all these different techniques is when you're working on your final self-portrait, feel free to combine several different kinds, right? We're definitely combining wash with a lot of things, but if you wanted to do a gradient and put some salt on top, or maybe the plastic wrap, you can do those things on your own final project. I do want to show you what it looks like when you just go from straight red to straight green instead of doing the orange to yellow to light green effect. So it works. It's just not the cutest in the middle, to be honest. This middle color kind of gets like a dark gray or brown color, and that's not what we are really going for. So our last section is wax resist. And let me grab a crayon. Wax resist is called that because crayons are actually made of wax. So when you use a crayon and you mix it with watercolors, the watercolor will not go over the wax because water and wax don't really mix. So I want to make sure that I'm really pushing hard on my crayon, getting all of that color on my paper. And then I can show you by just using a wash. How it sort of separates off the crayon and it doesn't get covered. The crayon shows through, and this will be one of those things that it'll be easier to see once you are working at your table. But the crayon shows through and almost separates the water from itself. So take some time, experiment with all of these different methods of watercolor. One